are you happy you went for it?
I know people want to hear that it's grueling and terrible, and there's a view by some that things are so difficult in the state of Illinois that it can't be a good job to be governor. But I have to tell you, I love the job, and it's for maybe a corny reason. But the idea that you can wake up in the morning and know that you can have an enormously positive effect on people's lives every single day. I mean, that's an amazing thing to wake up to think about. And it isn't just about making everything positive for everybody in the state. It's also protecting people against the ills that are coming at them. We have emergencies in the state. I have the ability to address problems on a daily, hourly, minute-by-minute basis. And I'll give you just one example. The measles outbreak.
Yes.
That we're all aware of at the beginning of the year. This was a national crisis. We heard about state of emergency in the city of New York. And this is something that every state needed to jump on immediately. So I didn't realize, and I was only in office for a couple of weeks at that point, I did not realize that really that I had the ability to immediately tackle this problem. That I had a department, public health, I knew that, but I also had some amazing people who work at the Department of Public Health. We have an immunization program in the state, although I will point out my predecessor pulled us out of the federal program, so it cost all of you $24 million more than it should have. But we had to go attack this problem. And we had mobile units that were able to go into communities where people weren't immunized. We had a public education program and so on. These were all things I didn't need the legislature for. And they were all things that I could do nearly immediately as governor. I could get my Department of Public Health director, Dr. Ezike, who's amazing, on the phone, work through the details of what are we going to do. And then she went at it. And so I just give you that as an example of you can solve problems, on a daily basis in this job, and it's uplifting to have a job, where you can do that. So I'm excited about the job, and I really have enjoyed every minute of it. Well, maybe not every minute, but.
So we all know the issues, and we're going to talk about some of them today that Illinois faces. They're well documented. They're well understood.
We have issues?
We have issues. We'll get to those. But one thing that's so interesting is you are trying to change the narrative around our state. You are trying to get out the positives, build on the strengths. And what is so important about changing that narrative for our state of Illinois?
So when you talk about changing the narrative, I think the narrative we need to change is that we can't solve these problems. That's the narrative that's been put in everybody's head. Somehow you just can't do it. The reality is they're hard. These are challenges. I talk about 5 things from a fiscal perspective that we need to focus on in the state. Everybody on my staff can cite these 5 things because they hear about them every day, every week that we're in office from me. And that's, pensions, property taxes, balancing the budget, paying down our bill backlog, and growing jobs in the state. Now, there are other things we could all cite that we need to do for sure, but just on the fiscal front and financial and economic front, those are 5 things that I have to spend every day, every week focused on, and we need to, work at solving those. But the narrative about Illinois is that we're a state on the rise, that we've had our challenges, that's for sure, that we were going in the wrong direction, but we are turning the ship in the right direction, and we are powering ourselves forward. And we have seen a lot of very positive things happening. And I'm not going to take credit for this. I'm just going to lay out for you one thing that you ought to feel good about the state of Illinois. We now, every region in the state of Illinois, we have 14 regions that report jobs to our Bureau of Labor Statistics, essentially in the state, IDES. And in every region of the state, we're growing jobs. That we now have the lowest unemployment rate ever recorded in the history of the state of Illinois at 3.9%. And again, whoever you want to give credit to for that, doesn't matter. Here's the thing. We all live in Illinois. Things are actually going the right direction.
So let's talk a little bit about the graduated income tax, the fair tax. Let's talk a little bit about this elephant in the room of pension reform. So why don't you start with the fair tax, and then we'll engage a little bit on pension reform.
We should start with the construct of the budget,
Good.
because all the rest of this is about the construct of the budget. First of all, the budget hasn't been balanced for, I don't know, a couple of decades at least. You would talk to people in government and they would privately tell you, people who are involved in creating the budget, even though we have a balanced budget requirement in our Constitution, what they would tell you is that, yeah, we made it look like it was balanced. I give you one example of that is that Governor Rauner included in I think every year that he was governor in the budget, the sale of the James R. Thompson Center as revenue for the state of Illinois. So we could talk about whether that's real revenue or not, but let's just say I don't know who's in real estate in the room other than you, but you, I don't know how many times you've sold a property twice, or 3 times, or 4 times. You can't do that. It's illegal, I guess, unless you're
Fuzzy math, accounting.
Yeah,
yes.
so so it is, and so that's an example of the what was in the budget that was supposedly balancing it each year, a projection that we would sell the Thompson Center, and then again and again. So we took all of those things out of the budget to start with because we wanted to know how big is the hole that everybody says is there, but nobody really talks about. How big is it? And it's a couple of $1 billion in what was a $39-40 billion budget. So then you're asking the question: how do you bridge the deficit, the structural deficit that exists? Yes. I like to say they're not. Everybody says, well, you cut expenses, you can bring in revenue, you can do both. But there's a third thing that goes along with all of that, and that's growing the economy. Because the truth is, the best revenue you get in government is revenue that comes from all of you being hugely successful. And indeed, I believe that's part of my job as governor, to help make all of you successful and all of the people of the state of Illinois successful. Our pension problem in the state is enormous. There's just no doubt about it. And it took us in this state, like 30 or 40 years. Some people say it's, 70 or 80 years, but it's 30 or 40 years to get into the situation that we're in, where we have roughly $134 billion of net pension liability in our state pension systems. Now, that's an aggregated number. It's what we're, essentially, part of what we're owing for many years to come for people who will retire. You ask about dealing with that problem with a pension amendment to the Constitution. What I would
shared with a graduated tax. So it's, again, a shared contribution toward fiscal stability and encouraging others, a pro-growth agenda, encouraging others, for example, to move to Illinois.
Indeed, I know you want to pair these things. They have to be voted on separately. You have to get them both on the ballot.
Right.
And you have to do that by getting 60% of the House of Representatives to vote for it, and 60% of the Senate to vote for it, and then 60% of the voters to vote for it.
Right.
So I'd make a couple of points about this. First, what you're talking about, and what everybody is really talking about, is there's a 3% COLA, cost of living adjustment, on pensions for the state of Illinois, 3%. And everybody knows that our inflation rate is lower than 3%. So what would this pension amendment do? It would essentially take it from 3% to whatever the inflation rate is for that year.
Reduce the rate of growth.
Exactly.
Yes.
And today, or at least recently, I haven't looked at it today, but recently our inflation rate has been 1.7%.
Yes.
So I just want to remind you that there were no required COLAs in the state until about 1968 or 9, when the first required COLA was put in. I think it was 1%, 1.5%. That was when inflation was above 1.5%. It was about 4%. Then there was an increase to that to 2%. That was when inflation was higher, at 5 or 6%. And then it went to 3% when inflation was higher than that. So the idea at the time was, people are losing value in their retirement. We should make up for it somehow. Let's give them a little piece of the inflation that they're experiencing. right? That was the idea at the time. As you know, for the last 20-some years, we've had tamed inflation, and the result of that is that 3% sounds exorbitant. At the time it was put in, didn't seem exorbitant. Okay, so if you change the law now, if you change the Constitution, what would you do? Well, for next year, hopefully inflation will stay tame. You would essentially save 1.3% essentially in the cost of living adjustment. That does not solve a $134 billion problem. It just doesn't. Is it a possible piece of it? Relatively, it's one of many things that you need to do. Sure, you might argue that. I would tell you that if you could get it through the House, and if you could get it through the Senate, and if you could get it on the ballot, therefore, and get 60% of the people to vote for it, which, by the way, the polls don't show you could get, but if you could do all of those things, you will then face the U.S. Constitution's Contracts Clause, which essentially says that a contract was entered into with people who took a job for the state, and it can't be abrogated even by a constitutional amendment to the Illinois Constitution. So I would say there are a lot of other ways to address pensions, and I am going after each and every one that I can go after. Here's an example of something that we did just this last year, and something that or I should say in the spring, and something that we did just a few days ago. In the spring, we expanded a program to buy out, a voluntary program to buy out retirees when they're retiring at 60% of what their pensions would be. People are choosing to take the money up front. It's saving the state money. In fact, a study was done of what the savings would be, and it's billions and billions, potentially $25 billion of savings, because people are, by the way, people are choosing it. Almost 20% of people who are retiring are choosing that buyout. That is good for the taxpayers and good for the people who are choosing it, who get the money up front and get to do whatever they want with that without having to wait. That's one thing. Just last week was the end of veto session. There were a lot of things in 3 days that that everybody was trying to accomplish. But one thing that I had my focus on, and that I worked, my Deputy Governor Dan Hines and his team, we all worked on pension consolidation among the police and fire pensions in suburban and downstate communities. This is a problem that so you've got 650 pension systems. They all have $2 to $10 or $15 million in them, many of them. They're getting very low returns as relative to all the other pension systems, larger ones in the state and nationally. And if you aggregated them, they could earn potentially 2 or more % more per year, which is huge over a time span. It compounds.
Yes.
That's something that's been worked on for 72 years in the state. No kidding. It's been worked on for 13 governors and 35 general assemblies. And we got that passed.